Hello everyone and welcome to a short introductory talk on medieval pilgrim badges. My name is Colin Torode and I am one of Heritage Eastbourne's volunteers. You may well be wondering what on earth pilgrim badges have to do with Eastbourne, to which the answer is very little really. But I am involved with the Sussex Historic Graffiti project, which is run by Heritage Eastbourne, and medieval graffiti is a subject that actually shares a great deal with medieval badges. So it was my knowledge of badges that got me involved with them and why it was suggested that I do this talk today. You may have seen Joe's recent presentation on our amazing graffiti in St Mary's Church. Many of the forms of graffiti that Joe mentioned are also found in medieval badges, and that would make a good subject for talk in itself, but not today. I'm not really going to be attempting to link this talk to Eastbourne. I'll mainly be looking at how pilgrim badges can inform us about medieval people in general, their beliefs and superstitions, and I'll also be looking at the practical side of things, how they were made, which is my main speciality. Pilgrim badges, or signs as they were called at the time, do give us some great insight into everyday medieval life. Pilgrims purchased them as souvenirs or proofs of pilgrimage, and usually wore them in their hats, just like the characters in this 15th century French manuscript illustration. There's a lot more to it than that though, as we shall see. Pilgrims certainly came through this part of Sussex, with a major pilgrimage route running the length of the county, marked on the 14th century Goth map as a prominent red line running west to east, or vertically on the map as we're looking at it. The route linked Southampton and Winchester to Chichester and on ultimately to Canterbury. If you're struggling to get your bearings, Lewes is the large settlement just below centre right, with Canterbury at the very top. This old route, which seems to have skirted around Eastbourne and the Pevensey levels, is now recognised and promoted as a reborn pilgrimage route once again. The Old Way, as it's been named by the British Pilgrimage Trust. So, what do we mean by a pilgrim badge? Here's a good example, a spectacular example in fact. A badge for St Thomas Becket, dating from the 14th century, made from pewter, or tin alloy to be more accurate, and coming from Canterbury. This badge, which is a little damaged, depicts the triumphal progress of Thomas Becket from Sandwich to Canterbury, following his return from exile in early December 1170. It's a big badge at 10 centimetres high, and badges such as this were essentially souvenirs. Perhaps you don't associate souvenirs with the Middle Ages, but this is where mass-produced tourist souvenirs start. If you either love browsing in gift shops at tourist centres today, or if you hate it, remember that it all started here with medieval pilgrims and their love of souvenir badges. The word souvenir does underplay it though. These were important things and they had a purpose beyond being keepsakes. Not all badges were as well made as this one, but whatever the quality, they often tell us a huge amount about medieval life. It's often the story where the real interest lies, because these were personal possessions and, as we shall see, they meant an awful lot to people. Before we deal in any detail with pilgrim badges, let's just deal with a common misconception. The idea that all medieval pewter badges were pilgrim badges. A true pilgrim badge is a very specific thing, a badge purchased at a centre of pilgrimage. But all badges tend to be mistakenly called pilgrim badges. So let's look at what is and what isn't a pilgrim badge. Here is a proper pilgrim badge, a badge depicting the Virgin Mary and coming from Eton. Badges depicting the Virgin Mary are very common, so how do we know that this one comes from Eton? Look beneath the Virgin Mary and you will see that it says so, in the form of a rebus or visual pun. A letter E followed by a barrel or ton, so E-ton. Rebuses were common at the time and it makes this badge easy to identify. They're certainly not all this easy though. Eton was rather short-lived as a centre of pilgrimage. Founded in 1440 by King Henry VI, with the snappy title of the King's College of Our Lady of Eton beside Windsor. To pay for the free education, The king endowed the college with land and relics, and it was dedicated to the feast of the Assumption of the Virgin. Henry VI heavily promoted Eton as a place of pilgrimage, and the links to the king can be seen clearly on the badge, with a shield displaying the royal arms incorporated into the design at the very base. It's partly missing in this example. A number of these Eton badges survive, so it must have been a popular place of pilgrimage, but only for a very short time, as King Henry VI was deposed in 1461 following defeat at the Battle of Towton. So the new king, Edward IV, Henry's enemy, removed much of Eton's land and relics. It's an example of pilgrimage as a political tool, something that became a common ploy. So that's a pilgrim badge, a badge intimately associated with a shrine or sanctuary, and that had, it was believed, taken on some of the saint's wonder-working properties. But a lot of medieval badges, even the obviously religious ones, had never been anywhere near a shrine. These are more accurately described as devotional badges. Here's a good example of a devotional badge. In this case, a 15th century badge for St. Christopher. This example was found in a dig at Swan Lane in London. Christopher was, and is, the patron saint of travellers, and is always depicted in medieval art carrying the Christ child on his shoulders. That's what Christopher means, Christ bearer. He's a well-known saint today, and he was one of the most popular and most universal saints of the Middle Ages. You could go on pilgrimage to Italy to see his giant tooth, but he wasn't really in the Premier League of saints, and we have far too many surviving badges for them all to be pilgrim badges. Without doubt, most of these badges are devotional badges. That's badges that were used to bring a person closer to their chosen saint. St. Christopher was never far from people's minds because, it was believed, he protected against sudden death. Most parish churches had a wall painting of him, often painted on the wall opposite the main door, and it was believed that just looking upon his image would protect against sudden death that day. Note the use of the word sudden. Medieval people realised that St. Christopher couldn't ward off death completely. Death was seen as the next step, but it was vitally important to have a good death. As someone lay dying, they needed to receive extreme unction, so as to be prepared for their onward journey, and for the parish church to ring the passing bell, to ward off the evil spirits who lay in wait for the soul of the soon-to-be departed. A sudden, unexpected death rendered this impossible, and so people sought St. Christopher's aid against this. The inscription on the wall painting from Wood Eaton Church in Oxfordshire says exactly this: "Who sees this image shall not die an ill death this day." It's an instance of the unofficial religion or superstition that dominated people's lives, and are the badges that connected people to the saints and helped them in their daily devotions. So much for the devotional, but we also find secular badges, badges with absolutely nothing to do with religion at all. These can be anything from lovers' tokens, which are simple badges often in the forms of hearts, flowers, arrows, birds or faithful dogs, intended to be exchanged as gifts, and we can see a selection of lovers' tokens here, to badges that mark the customs of the changing seasons, or that displayed loyalty to a political cause, or that marked the individual as a supposed member of a nobleman's affinity, a bit like a modern supporters badge. Plus we get lots of very rude badges, in the same spirit as the Roman facina, and intended to ward off evil spirits. But these also undoubtedly gave the badge makers an opportunity to poke fun and generally have a good laugh, just like manuscript illustrators did with their marginalia or drolleries. Even these rude badges were often described as pilgrim badges, which is ridiculous. We haven't really got time to deal with these secular badges in detail today, perhaps another day, because they're a fascinating subject too, with all sorts of customs and tales to be told. So we've looked at the generalities, at the various types of badges that were made, but how were they made? Back at the beginning I described the pilgrim badges as mass-produced. which I know from experience does surprise people, but the fact is that Pilgrim badges were made in huge quantities, with Pilgrim resorts often recording the manufacture and sale of 100,000 badges every year. Needless to say, these could not be individually crafted works of art. They were made quickly and sold cheaply. But how did they do that? We're looking here at some of my replica moulds, and this shows the technique that they used. The moulds were made from stone, with the design engraved into one side and the back or counter mould carrying a cut for the pin. The finer the grain of the stone, the better the mould. The mould was assembled and molten tin alloy poured in. The metal works at a very low temperature, so it cools quickly. Each cast taking maybe 30 seconds or so from start to finish. Some of the original moulds carried engravings for 2 or more badges, speeding the process up even more. Once you see how quickly they could work, you can understand how these extraordinary quantities of badges could be produced. The manufacture of Pilgrim badges even attracted the attentions of one of the greatest innovators of mass production, Johann Gutenberg, inventor of the movable type printing press, but also a Pilgrim badge maker. So we've looked at the basics, but we haven't looked at how it all started. So in the time left, I'm going to go back to the Pilgrim badges and try to explain their origins and look briefly at the various ways in which they were used and how it all came to an end. For the origins of manufactured souvenirs in England, we need to return to Thomas Becket, who we met back at the beginning of the talk, Archbishop of Canterbury, murdered in his own cathedral on the 29th of December 1170, supposedly after King Henry II spoke those famous words. The truth is, we don't know what words he actually spoke in his fit of rage. Whatever, the event shook the church to its very core and very quickly created a pilgrimage, the popularity of which had not previously been seen in England, although pilgrimage certainly had been a part of Christianity for centuries prior to this. The manuscript illustration on screen is one of the earliest known depictions of the martyrdom of St Thomas Becket, produced just a decade or so after his death, but the same scene is also depicted on the very first manufactured Pilgrim souvenirs. These first souvenirs were not badges but ampulas, little holy water containers made from tin or lead, and in the case of Canterbury ampulas carrying not just holy water but water tinged with a little of St Thomas's blood. Before the introduction of these manufactured souvenirs, pilgrims had probably collected dust from the floor or scrapings from the wall. It just seems to have been something that pilgrims always did. These earliest ampulas, dating to the decades immediately after the martyrdom, and certainly no later than the late 12th century, were tiny, about the size of the one in my hand in the bottom left. That one may not be a Canterbury example, but the one at the top of the screen certainly is from Canterbury, as it depicts the martyrdom in simplified form. One of the early miracle stories, written shortly after the martyrdom, tells of a pilgrim who stole an ampulla from the Canterbury Cathedral workshop, but who received a miraculous cure when he confessed his sin. Ampullas can also be seen in the early 13th century miracle windows of Canterbury Cathedral, this one depicting the miraculous cure of William Fitzusulph, who was supposedly cured through the agency of Canterbury water. Soon these ampullas developed from these tiny and rather crude examples to much bigger, fancier ones. Here's a splendid example of a typical mid-13th century ampulla, depicting St Thomas on the front and the full martyrdom scene on the reverse. What is significant is the outer border, containing a prayer that became a fixture on this type of ampulla. It reads, "St Thomas is the best healer of the worthy sick." A reminder of the miracles that St Thomas could perform, and also a warning not to place faith in the medicine offered by healers. Through the 13th century, Canterbury produced some of the most accomplished pilgrim souvenirs that would ever be seen, unrivalled in their quality and variety. The problem with ampullas is that they are difficult things to make, so by perhaps the early years of the 14th century, the far simpler badges started to be produced, and although ampullars would remain popular, badges became the primary form of souvenir from now on. This is just a selection of the many types of Canterbury Pilgrim badge produced through the 14th and 15th centuries. They ranged from the magnificent to the banal, but whatever their quality, they contained in the pilgrim's mind that essential thaumaturgic or wonder-working property. No pilgrimage would be complete without the purchase of a pilgrim souvenir to pin in the hat and carry home. Not only did it carry the saint's miraculous powers, but it also served to mark the wearer out as a pilgrim, which was important, with Christians, in theory, obliged to give alms and protection to pilgrims on their journey. But I've spoken a lot of St Thomas and Canterbury, which may give the impression that it was all about him, but this wasn't the case at all. By the 14th century, a whole host of saints came to the fore. With the late medieval cult of saints in full flow, there were numerous resorts from which the pilgrims could choose. From the major European sites, such as Rome, Compostela or Aachen, to many closer to home offerings. Here's just a small selection from English sites, but there were hundreds, many of them producing souvenir badges for the pilgrim to carry home. The one to the lower right is from the British Museum and is thought to represent our most important Sussex saint, St Richard of Chichester. It's a strange looking badge, and I suspect it's actually part of something much larger, perhaps part of a panel, but it may well be depicting St Richard's miracle where he knocked over a chalice of consecrated wine without spilling any. Not a great miracle and not a great badge, but this is the only example of a pilgrim souvenir associated with St Richard. Chichester was certainly a fairly important place of pilgrimage though, so popular in fact that the throng of pilgrims clamouring to reach St Richard's shrine even led to fights within the cathedral, with pilgrims even setting about each other with their staffs. In 1487 Bishop Story, clearly having had enough of this behaviour, banned pilgrims from carrying their staffs into the cathedral, ordering that only crosses and banners should be carried to the shrine. So that leaves the question of how were they used. It may seem a daft question with a badge, but not so. These weren't any old badge, remember, they contained a little of the saint's wonder-working power, and they were effectively tertiary relics, so it shouldn't be surprising that we have evidence for the many uses to which they were put. They were worn, of course, sometimes long after the completion of the pilgrimage, and worn usually in the hat, or on the scrip or bag. But in addition they could be hung up in the home on little wooden panels, as we can see lower centre on the screen, and they were often sewn into devotional books of hours down to the left here. An interesting example of a cheap item seemingly enhancing the spiritual value of a high status item. And they could even be fixed to reliquary caskets, such as the one top right from Torode. They could even be incorporated into church bell moulds, so that the image of the badge would be incorporated into the cast bell metal. It was believed that the bell then absorbed that saintly protection and emanated it when rung. Most of the examples of badges and bells are German, although whether this practice was a peculiarity of Germany is difficult to say, as we have so few surviving medieval English bells. Although these uses show how highly thought of these badges could be, it also has to be said that they were sometimes discarded, thrown away, not carelessly, but it seems as a sort of offering. Many surviving pilgrim badges have been found in river mud beneath medieval crossings, sometimes carefully folded before being thrown away. No one thought to write down why they did this, but I strongly suspect it marked the completion of the pilgrimage, thanks for a safe return or marking the completion of a vow. We certainly have records of people marking the promise to go on pilgrimage by bending a penny in half, seemingly earmarking the coin as a future offering, and also making a sort of contract with the saint. It seems only logical that these deliberately bent badges marked the end of the contract. Similarities to offerings made into water by earlier cultures are clear, And of course we still throw money into wishing wells today. It's a peculiar thing, really. Hopefully this all illustrates the power that the cult of saints had over people, and the extent to which people felt protected by their saint, and how they used their badges to connect to the saint. It was a two-way relationship. All good things must come to an end though, and as we move into the 16th century, the end of the cult of saints and the pilgrimage was in sight. One of the last great saints and pilgrimages was that of King Henry VI. Remember, we met him a while ago with his creation of Eton College and its pilgrimage to Our Lady of Eton. After his murder in 1471, in typical fashion, he became far more popular in death than he had been in life. Many miracles were recorded in his name, including one where he saved a small child who had swallowed and choked on a St. Thomas Becket pilgrim badge, and another when the young daughter of a Sussex knight was saved after she got a plumstone stuck up her nose. Henry was never canonised, but he was regarded as a saint as good as any other, despite his unofficial status, with his tomb at Windsor becoming a hugely popular place of pilgrimage. The cast iron arms box where countless pilgrims offered up their pennies still stands next to his tomb today. I mention Henry VI at this point, not just because he marks the final flowering of the cult of saints, but because one of his adherents was the man who brought the age of pilgrimage to a close, King Henry VIII. Although Henry VIII put paid to pilgrimage with the end of monasticism, he didn't completely abandon the saints himself. Henry VIII had been on pilgrimage himself. He died as a Catholic, don't forget, and he instructed in his will that the banner of King Henry the Saint, that's Henry VI, should be carried at his funeral. But with the Reformation, the age of pilgrimage was dead, and with it, the age of our first real tourist souvenir, the Pilgrim badge. Thank you very much for listening.